Welcome to the Real Triathlon Podcast. I'm your host, Garrick Lowen, here with Nicholas Chase and Jackson Laundry.
Welcome back to the show. We have one of, I'd say, a friend. Andy, you're a pal. I mean, I've been able to host you in St. George. Precision has, as a unit, has always been part of my life for many years now. So yeah, thanks for coming on as a pal to do us a favor and talk to us about everything I've been personally thinking about, and things I think we should probably learn a little bit more high end or higher level viewpoint of what precision really is. So Andy, how you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Nick, and thanks for coming on. And yeah, big thanks to you for everything you've done for us over the last few years. We obviously, like you say, we connected in St. George when St. George became the centre of the triathlon universe a few years ago. And
Yeah.
the fact that you've been hosting sweat testing there and helping our team whenever we're in town has been amazing. So really appreciate all of your efforts to support what we're doing as a brand.
I think I really love what you all do, and there's tons of products out there these days, and there's a lot of competition in the market, especially for hydration. And now sodium is becoming a very prevalent topic, which is what you've all been dominating. But it feels like there's just so much more that precision does. You all are just genuinely great people to work with. Everybody on your team, I've not had one experience or a race or event where I've sent pro athletes to where they haven't had photography or some lovely pre and post race chats or dinners or meetups. Like, you all just have a great group. How did you find such good people to work at PH?
Yeah, it's really kind of you to say, and we are really proud of the squad we've got here. And the squad has been growing steadily for years. And it started out, it was me and Johnny and Dave, our marketing director, who were the kind of three of us who used to work together in my shed, basically, and then we needed someone else to help with something, and we recruited JP, who's now our head of customer service. And he's a triathlete, a runner who I used to swim with. So he kind of came into the fold. And then we've been working with Sean in Canada, who is distributing our products in Canada for years, and he's still on the squad. So we've been like this kind of rolling this rolling Velcro that have picked people up along the way and then not let go of a lot of them. I'm really, really incredibly proud of how we've managed to kind of create a long-term team here. We've got people who've been here for 8, 9, 10 years now. And I think a lot of what you're describing there is that we are people who are sort of like, we're athletes, we're involved in the sport, particularly in triathlon, but these days in all sorts of sports. We've got trail runners in the office, we've got cyclists, we've got mountain bikers, we've got swimmers. We're doing this because we love doing it. We love being involved in the sport. As a youngster, all I wanted to be was a pro athlete. And when that was not really presenting as a viable option, although I gave it a good go, I couldn't see myself working in any other field than the sport. And I think if you spoke to a lot of people who work here, they probably, if they, no one's had the same journey, but we all kind of feel like we're part of it. Whereas I think a lot of our competitors in sports nutrition, probably less so nowadays, but in the past have certainly been big corporate food companies who have a sports nutrition line and that kind of thing. And they bring a different, they bring a different vibe to it. They're not necessarily as passionate about the sport as we are. So it's nice to hear that connection with the sport and the people that do it comes across, because that's in our DNA.
I think as a real tri squad, as we're trying to create a lot of that same mechanism and organically grow and just bring on great athletes who just want to support each other, I think that's the PH vibe as well. Every time I'm around you all, there's like a great dinner, a great meetup, and all the pros flock to you all. And I think initially what attracted me was your marketing approach. When you first came into the scene, you all were so generous with providing product to most anybody, even if they were partnered with another company and they just wanted to try your product. And I think that was transformative for me, how that was very giving, but it also did you so much justice, because not only were the products that I was taking working at the time, but then I found a more superior aspect that you all were providing with more research, more passion. And I think that's really what turn the tide, I think, to sway more people to pay a lot of attention, and also branding. You've done well to market yourselves with not super niche, but I'd say it's expanding now with sodium. Sodium has been probably your biggest, I don't know, biggest talking point. Well, anytime I see you on a podcast, it's athletes talking about sodium and how to do things better. I sweat testing hundreds of athletes myself. It's a big topic. And in your opinion, has that been the tipping point to make pH a brand that people really pay attention to? And is now finally the industry starting to pay more attention?
It was definitely our big calling card early on, because as you probably know, and as some people will know, the genesis of the business was the fact that I had such big problems with sodium loss myself as an athlete. So I used to race in cool conditions, and I was achieving some decent results, some podium at kind of 70.3 level races, top tens in Ironman races. I would then go to somewhere hot to race, and my races would fall apart. And it was like someone had pulled the plug out on me, and it was because I was getting hyponatremia. I was suffering horrendously with cramping. When I got to the finish of these races, often I was covered in salt, absolutely covered in it. And it was because a friend of mine who's a doctor pushed me to get a sweat test and said, I think the problem here is really extreme electrolyte loss, maybe electrolyte and fluid loss. We need to investigate that. I had a sweat test, and that was essentially what started the idea for what eventually became the business. And that was a long journey, because I think the sweat test that I had was like in the early 2000s. It was certainly before 2005, and it wasn't until 2011 we set the company up. But I had this sweat test. It identified that I lose well over twice the amount of sodium of the average person. And when we looked at my race nutrition plan, it was pretty obvious that I was replacing a very small percentage of that. And I then started to really change my approach. At the time, there's a lot of high strength electrolyte products on the market now. At the time, there weren't. Most sports drinks had 400, 500 milligrams of sodium per litre. So I was having to supplement everything I took with salt tablets. I went so far as to start importing some electrolyte tablets into the UK and trying to resell them, because I thought there's a gap here, because if I'm not going to be the only person who needs these. And then it was really, so the sodium part of the conversation, and me trying to address this idea that, not everyone's sodium loss is equal. Some people like me, need to take loads of sodium on board, whereas other people need less, has always been the main conversation, but it's been the thing that set us apart, along with offering sweat testing as a service. And so I would say that's been on a pretty wild journey in the last 10 or 12 years, because when we launched the company in 2011, I would say there was some debate in the industry around, do you need to take individualized sodium or not? It was starting to become a talking point, but in a small way, in a niche way. Then in 2012, like 1 year after we launched, Dr. Tim Noakes published a book called Waterlogged. And Tim Noakes at this time especially was a big name in sports physiology and nutrition. And he basically categorically pulled the rug from under our feet, saying like athletes don't need sodium. He really went on a rant about that, which at the time felt like something which could undermine our business massively. As it turned out, what it did was it prompted a lot of people to engage in the question around sodium, and probably in the long run did us a favor, because we were able to start to show some of our sweat testing data and engage in discussions with people who were on the fence about this. And I think time has shown that, there's a lot of good in Tim Noakes' book, but the stuff about athletes not needing sodium is very questionable. And the fact that we're still here with a lot of good success stories with athletes with higher sodium loss 13 years later is testament to that fact. I'm going on a bit now, but I'm going to just give you one example, because I had a fantastic email just today. In 2015, we sweat tested an athlete who had really, really high sweat sodium. And this guy, he showed 120 millimoles on the machine. So that's like nearly 2,500 milligrams of sodium per litre. And there's a good explanation for that, because when he'd done the test, he told us that he has cystic fibrosis. So he has a genetic disease called CF, but he's a cyclist, and he was going out to do the Étape du Tour in France, and he was a persistent cramper, and he wanted to get his hydration right. So we sweat tested him. Sure enough, his sweat test was off the charts. We gave him a pretty aggressive regime of loading up with salt and sodium for the event, and he got through it without cramping and without a problem. It kind of fizzled after that, and then I heard from him this morning because there's a new cystic fibrosis drug on the market, and he's been taking it for a few years, and he's had a sweat test, and true to form, because the drug's working for him, it's brought his sweat sodium down. But it got us talking again, and we talked about the fact that how over the last 10 years he's been able to do multiple mega endurance bike rides, loads of stuff that he never thought he'd be able to do, because after 3 or 4 hours in the past he always used to get cramps. And so those kind of edge cases for me are the ones that really demonstrate that, yeah, when you get someone in the extreme with sodium loss, there's a very, very strong case for supplementing them very heavily. And that doesn't mean that everyone needs to supplement heavily, but it means that we're all on a continuum towards that or away from that, depending where we are with our sweat sodium, and that thinking about sodium intake, fluid intake on an individual basis is, yeah, a very, very valid concept.
There's obviously so many tangent questions I wanted to go on after this specific case, having tested athletes and having put myself through some of these rigors and figuring out what I'm doing right or wrong versus my performance values. But I'd say one of the questions I want to ask, because it's been on my mind as a sodium tester for you all, is absorption rates. How would somebody with that much loss handle taking in that much and being able to absorb? I mean, does the body tend to build in a lot more ways that it can have new pathways to distribute the sodium? Because I mean, you can only take in so much at certain times for the gut then to become overloaded. And what have you found more optimal for those who are really on that fringe case where they lose quite a high, maybe over 15 to 1800 milligrams per liter? How are they able to take in as much and absorb it? Does the body do something special for them, or can anybody train that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we've dealt with a number of these kind of high sodium and fluid loss edge cases in the last 10 years, because as we've been seen as having some expertise in that area, people seek us out. So I think there's a couple of examples that are worth highlighting to illustrate that. The first one is we got approached by a tennis player a few years ago who had only kind of relatively moderate sweat sodium losses. I think he was in the middle of the bell curve for what people lose, so around 900 to 1,000 milligrams per litre. But his sweat rate is incredibly high. So this guy was losing in excess of 3 or 4 litres per hour some of the time. And he's a big dude. He's like 6'6" or 6'7". He's very accomplished tennis player. This guy made the final at Wimbledon and stuff like that. But playing in Florida, playing in Atlanta in the kind of ATP tournaments, he would often get carted off. He had to change his shoes and socks during tournament, during matches, because of the amount of sweat, because they would squelch. Wow. This is how much you sweat. And he kind of came to us saying, look, what can I do about this? And we had a real hard time actually getting enough fluid and sodium back into him during games and between games, because the physical level of loss did seem to exceed his ability to absorb. But to give you an idea, this guy was, at some points, we were having him drink close to 2.5 litres per hour during games, and his body seemed to be able to tolerate that. Now, bear in mind, he's a big guy. This guy's like 6'7" tall, so the sheer length of his GI tract is going to be far bigger than yours and mine. So you'd expect him to be able to handle more fluid. But I think we did see over time, with a bit of practice and with the body's need for that fluid and salt, that he appeared to have an abnormally high rate of absorption compared with the average person. It's very rare. If you look at our case study database, it's rare you see many triathletes drinking significantly more than 1.2 litres per hour, even during really hot, long races. Another example that we had is we have another guy who is a triathlete who has raced in Australia. He lives in Australia, races in Australia a lot where it's hot and humid. He's not a big guy actually, but he has a really high sweat rate and really high sodium loss. So he loses about 2,000 milligrams of sodium per litre and about 2 to 2.5 litres of sodium per hour. And I mean, there's case studies. This guy's called Luke Henderson. There's some case studies on our website, and it's been an ongoing battle with him to get him to replace an adequate amount of fluid and sodium. And on occasion, when you read through those case studies, you'll see sometimes he's probably taken too much fluid and too much sodium and become bloated. He's never really struggled so much from the absorption side as he has from sort of maybe just overloading his body with fluid and salt in a bid to try and match what's being lost. We've made some adjustments recently and actually tempered the amount of fluid, increased the amount of sodium and the actual amount of sodium chloride, so the actual salt rather than just sodium for him, which seems to have helped, because we worked with a kidney doctor who suggested that they possibly, by taking in lots and lots of fluid and sodium but not enough chloride, he was actually disturbing the acid-base balance in his body, which was causing fluid to shift between his intracellular and extracellular compartment, and having given him more good old salt tablets as opposed to just relying on sodium in sports drinks, that appears to have corrected things in the last couple of races. So I think that when you get really, really high levels of loss, you have to be a bit creative. You also kind of have to accept that if you're someone with really, really high levels of loss, the chances are you're not going to be able to always adequately meet your needs, that your hydration regime is going to have to be well practiced. It's going to have to be more aggressive than most people. And that also it probably has to play into race selection a little bit. You know, there are just some people who are not going to be suited to going well at Kona, who are going to be better off looking at a Northern Hemisphere, fringe season Ironman, because as their A race, because their physiology just works better in that environment.
Man, that's like a death sentence for triathletes who are just like, I can overcome, I will do everything to be everyone's hero. And a physiological limitation like that must just be catastrophic. Like, I just know that I will not do well at Kona because I lose too much. Can't do it.
Well, there's an example of a guy you probably know who's that is his case really, is Tim Reed, the Aussie triathlete who's relatively recently retired from pro competition. And Tim was a world-class athlete, world 70.3 champion, never ever really hit his stride in Kona. And based on numerous conversations with Tim over the years and looking at some of his sweat data, a big proportion of that I think contributed to the fact that he is a small guy with a massive sweat rate and just always struggled to keep up with those losses in those extreme conditions.
Yeah.
And so I would never say to people if your physiology is going to make it impossible for you to do things in whatever conditions, but it can stack the odds against you and make it far harder to do so. And probably, and that's one of the weaknesses, although Ironman is changing a little bit with the move of the World Championships between Nice and Kona and that sort of thing. But it's kind of one of those unique sports where actually it's always historically suited those people who are good in heat and humidity, because the World Champs was always somewhere hot and humid. In most sports, the World Champs moves around, doesn't it? And you maybe get a shot at doing a cold race or something like that.
Exactly. The fact that even the majority of the most popular races are typically in the warmest months, just to secure best opportunity for a race to proceed with good weather and not have extra tents and heaters. Like, how many times have you gone to a triathlon and it's been really frigid cold and you've actually enjoyed yourself? It's not the best recipe. I mean, it's fun once or twice, but it's not the best recipe.
It's a bit more normal if you grew up in the UK as well.
Yeah, you guys probably have nothing but that. I remember when I did the age group world championship in London years and years and years ago, it was frigid. I think my feet were standing on the cobbles next to the serpentine, and it felt like every step I was just readdressing a new needle points in my feet, new pressure acupuncture points that I was touching. So it was frigid. But I have actually an interesting, I wouldn't say it's a dilemma, but it's something that I've been dealing with personally when it comes to hydration, fluid, and then a whole lot of urination during races. And I wanted to just get your personal opinion on this just because you're here. But I've talked to a couple of dietitians. One of our dietitians works at Fuelin, and she's kind of pointed out some things like, my typical breakfast would be, I didn't think it was tons of fluid, but my typical race breakfast was like 3.5 or 3 cups of applesauce with a little protein shake and a banana. So not a lot of heavy chewable food. And then I would do some light sodium preloading depending upon the heat of the race, just to make sure I was topped off, as I tell everyone to do. But man, sometimes during the swim, like at Challenge Roth this year, specifically, it was rainy and cold. But I think I peed on the bike maybe like 6 or 7 times, and even during a half, if it's been cold, I've peed maybe like 3 to 5 times. And it's also been it causes a lot of kidney pain in the back if you don't go pee, which means the aero position and putting power out's tough. So I usually am not even taking in sometimes a full liter during a race, but I still will be peeing quite a bit and taking the sodium load approach. Now, I know this might be a fringe case, and there's probably a lot more follow-up questions, but what would cause, in your opinion, an excessive level of urination if there is adequate sodium loading, adequate blood plasma levels? And is it a circumstance where it's probably just maybe I have a smaller bladder, or maybe I have a very extreme diuretic when it is cold and pee a lot? Any initial thoughts?
So I was going to say the first one to address really would be backing out to 2-3 days before the race, really, and starting to look at what your hydration habits are like on that, because that amount of peeing does tend to suggest that you are overhydrated in some way. The body's response to that is then to cause the kidneys to work and get rid of fluid. And the fact that you're doing that quite so frequently, like we would often say that peeing, maybe in an Ironman, peeing a couple of times on the bike is good. Once is probably a good sign that you're not getting dehydrated, but that you're not overhydrated. I certainly would say that like 6 or 7, as you've identified, is probably an excessive amount. So I'd be looking at that week leading in, and specifically the last 3 or 4 days, and making sure that you're not drinking too much just generally in those days, because a lot of athletes, I was very guilty of this. Like, we'll do the nervous drinking thing in the last few days before a big race, because we all know that dehydration, starting on the start line dehydrated, is bad news. So we drink a little bit more, as well as the fact that we're reducing our activity levels, so we're probably not sweating as much. That might be more than we need to increase it, and so that you end up starting with too much fluid on board. Also, with the pre-race sodium load, I would consider reducing that in terms of volume. So we tend to give a ballpark figure of about 16 ounces, maybe 24 ounces for bigger athletes, but it might be that you're okay with like half of that. You might only need 8 or 10 ounces, or 6 to 8 ounces, just to make sure you're topped off if you're going in well hydrated. So I'd be playing around with strategically reducing the amount of fluid in the last 2 days, and on the morning of specifically. The thing around the diuresis response in cold water, that is an interesting one, because that definitely does affect some people more than others. And it's a well-documented fact that for a lot of people, when you immerse yourself in cool or cold water, then that provokes a reaction for the kidneys to pee, because basically the blood volume moves away from the skin into the central circulation, and it kind of makes your kidneys and your baroreceptors looks to them like you've got more blood, you've got more blood volume, so you pee. But you would normally expect that to finish when you get out of the water. That's not going to carry on, or shouldn't carry on for too much longer. So I think they're the two most likely causes, and I'd be addressing that one about simply like, is it fluid overload to start with, and getting a handle on that.
Absolutely. I've thought about that many times too. I subsequently backing off in those previous days. I've never been one to, like, if the second I start to ever, and this is years ago, had to pee like multiple times within a 30-minute period, and it's very clear, I would for sure back off. And I think I've kind of gotten away from that. And it's been a bit interesting journey on that. I think it might be more of a fringe situation, because I've done like a 2:30 marathon with 0 water, 40-degree air temperature, cold, and taken 1 gel. I've done things very, very minimally. I don't feel like I have a super high sweat rate. I'm not typically caked, but we'll see what happens to try to get under control. But I definitely want to back off on most everything in terms of prehydration.
There might be some other things you could do as well, specifically around looking at kidney function tests and whatnot from a medical standpoint. We've got a nephrologist, a kidney doctor that we work very closely with, so that could actually be a connection that we can make for you to have a chat with someone. He's also a triathlete, which is why he's really super useful to consult with us, because he understands the sport and that kind of
That'd
thing.
be great.
So,
that'd be great,
yeah.
because I've had so many races where there's been like, I'm in the group, I'm sitting pretty good, and then I've had to pee like a couple of times, and I just trail off the back, and then have to yin yang or yo-yo a lot, and that'd be a good one. Another case I ran into sweat testing, and I'm sure you've seen a bunch of this too, is I had an athlete come to me, and she was dead set that she was going to be, I'm gonna top your charts. I'm gonna lose so much sodium during this test. It's going to be the highest. I am caked with white crustiness after every workout. Well, she was only losing like 400, milligrams per liter, not very high at all. But I think, like to your point earlier, her sweat rate was so high that she was losing liters per hour. And that's really what further kind of made the problem. And I think that's really where I wanted to kind of take the conversation next, is the adaptability of two things. Number one, we know that with the sweat testing that I've been doing over the years, and you all have done, routinely, is there any correlation in training the body's level of climate or adaptability on that climate to, like, let's say over a 2-year period, to secrete less sodium concentration? Does that typically change more than 1% to 2% based off of any, because that's the number one question I get, and I wanted to really get your insight on, is that adaptable, or is that pretty much always guaranteed, no matter the climate, no matter who you are, you're not going to fluctuate much?
Yeah, it's a question we get asked a lot, and I think to address your first point about this athlete who came in like pretty certain they were going to have a high sweat sodium, then find out they've got a low. I agree with your point entirely that they probably, that from what you've said, it sounds like they would have a high sweat rate, because we get that a lot of the time as well. Athletes struggle to separate the concept of sweat rate from sweat sodium. Like someone who sweats a lot sometimes assumes that they'll be very salty. Now, as you pointed out, they can still have a very high net sodium loss, even if their sodium concentration is only moderate, because your net losses are derived from the concentration of your sweat multiplied by the rate that you're sweating at. And so if you've got a high sweat rate, you're going to lose a lot of sodium along with fluid, it's not just reliant on concentration, if that makes sense. So I would say that's not uncommon. And what we sometimes end up doing with athletes like that, a bit like we do with our tennis players, actually increasing the sodium content of some of the drinks in the knowledge that they're never going to meet their fluid volume targets, or get close to them, because the amount of fluid that they're losing is so high. But in order to compensate that and maybe retain some more of the fluid and balance out some of those sodium losses, having a slightly higher concentration of sodium in the drinks is worthwhile. To your point about the stability of sweat sodium with acclimatization over time, when you take an untrained person and you acclimate them from a cool environment to a hot environment, you typically see that their sweat rate goes up quite considerably and that their sweat sodium comes down. Now, some papers have shown reductions as much as 35% in sweat sodium, and some pretty big increases in sweat rate as well. With trained athletes, typically the ones that we've repeat tested a lot, myself included, we've seen less of a swing. You do generally see a downward trend in sweat sodium when someone acclimates to a hot environment, as well as an increase in their sweat rate. But the magnitude of those differences is perhaps smaller than it is with untrained people, because trained athletes, even me training in the UK in moderate to cool conditions, I'm getting my core body temperature up, I'm increasing my sweat rate, and I'm potentially decreasing my sweat sodium every time I go out training, which is daily. So I'm not the same kind of specimen as a completely untrained person. So typically we've seen a handful of people whose sweat sodium levels have dropped considerably with heat acclimatization, but the majority, it seems to be a few percent. To give you a concrete example of that, when I come to when I leave the UK winter, usually around the start of February, and come to the US, I tend to go to Florida and Phoenix because we do a big loop around the baseball teams in spring training. So I go from a really cold environment, like single digit, like close to freezing temperatures quite often. And then I go straight into kind of like 80s, 90s some of the time. And I'll train every day. If I sweat test myself before I go and when I get back, my sweat sodium might drop from 1800 to 1650 or 1700 milligrams a litre. So it shifts downwards, but it doesn't really materially shift. It doesn't go from 1800 to 400. So we've always said to people, like, typically if you're well trained, you have a sweat sodium test, the likelihood is that number is putting you in the right zone for where you're going to be at. So it may fluctuate on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, but it's unlikely to fundamentally change category, if that makes sense. So it won't have so much of a bearing on your any changes to a hydration regime.
In my mind, I've almost thought of it and maybe even have described it periodically as each athlete has their own thumbprint when it comes to sodium concentration within their sweat. And that's really what I was trying to get at was, yes, this test is valuable because you might be a 400 or you might be an 1800. And no matter what, you might still fluctuate 2 to 5% up or down based off of climate and training stimulus. And that's kind of what I've been relaying, and to the validity of why this testing is so applicable. The other point of that is, what have you seen change in terms of volume losses? Because we have athletes who will go race in Kona and they will do some passive sauna work after sessions. Does heat prep training, does that make you more efficient at retaining sodium or vital minerals? And does that, obviously you're going to be more focused on cooling the body, so the sweat rate might increase. Am I on the right ballpark with those assumptions?
Yeah, definitely. So you will start to sweat more if you undergo heat acclimatization protocol. Now, we have way less data on sweat changes in sweat rate versus changes in sweat sodium, because typically our sweat test, as you know, focuses on looking at sweat sodium, and we measure sweat rate by weighing athletes pre and post, so we don't get as much data on that. However, where that's going to be changing in two ways. One, we've put a heat chamber in our offices now, so we're going to be, at the moment we're not open to the public, as it were. We're doing in-house testing, but in the next few weeks and months we will be opening the doors to have people coming through and doing some heat prep work for Kona this year in there. We've already got some trials underway with members of staff who are training for events, so we're going to start to gather a lot more data on exactly what changes in sweat rate and sweat sodium concentration you can expect during a very intense block of heat training. Our expectation is that we'll see a significant increase in sweat rate, particularly if people are coming from a relatively unacclimated state from working out in cold conditions. But I would still suggest that we're unlikely to see huge swings in sweat sodium. We expect to see that being a lot more stable. The other thing that's going to drive more knowledge in this area, when they're working really well, is that there's a lot more wearable technology coming to the market, and there's a lot of wearable technology already out there. We're not convinced yet that any of it is really accurate and repeatable enough to be day-to-day useful to athletes, but there's big progress being made all the time. We've got about 6 sweat sensors on test in our lab at the moment, and all the time they're improving. So I don't think it's going to be too many months or years before we start to get real-time data on sweat sodium and sweat rate, at which point a lot of these kind of questions that you're asking, athletes are going to be able to answer for themselves by using an at-home test.
Yeah, I had actual Flow Bio, I think, was one of the ones I had been, Stefan Vanderfloot was one of the guys who's put that, I think, in front of me once. And well, I did think the wearables were probably a great way to capture some cool data. The applicable nature of it over time, I never seen any long-term data points to show, but I'm sure, I can't wait to see when you guys publish. And I think that's the best part about what you all are doing is like, and I think that's also why I resonate so well with Precision Hydration as a company, and the other sponsors we have or partners we have. Like we've got BiSaddle, who is filling a hole in the industry with, we are not anatomically identical. Why are we all riding the same saddles? Let's be very unique. We've got custom bikes, custom positions. Now we're trending into custom fueling protocols because we can actually test what's happening in a lab. And I think what we're doing here, even in Southern Utah, we're developing a center for extreme human performance. And that's something else I was going to ask you about is, what if you had $100 million to put into a facility? What key aspects for performance training would you put that money into for lab testing?
I actually reckon it, with a huge budget like that, of course, there's loads of things you could do in a lab. What I'd be interested in doing to put some of that money to work is seeing how we could arrange for really, really good field studies to be done, because I think there's something interesting about, if we take, for example, what Nike did with the Sub 2 or the Breaking
Yeah.
2 project, where they really, really they went after that. It was a huge, we all know it's a huge marketing effort, but there was a lot of science went into the preparation, and they learned a lot about what happened, about what affects marathon performance, because they genuinely wanted to try and look at breaking that barrier. I think you can study. The biggest problem I have with a lot of the research papers that we see coming out are that ethics and constraints around what you're allowed to do and what you can physically do with athletes in a lab put athletes under very different stresses and strains to what we all put ourselves out there on a hot sunny Sunday morning somewhere in southern Florida or whatever. It's like we push ourselves for more hours at a higher pace in hotter, more extreme conditions, and really push ourselves to the limit in those competitive environments. Yet very little data is actually gathered when that's going on. And one of the things we've talked about here is that if we ever had the funding to do it, or if we could generate the funding to do it, we would love to organize a competitive triathlon in very hot conditions with proper prize money so that athletes are incentivized to actually race for it. But what we'd do is we'd probably stop the athletes after the swim, after the bike, after the run for a short period, allow for things like weights to be taken, bloods to be taken, stuff standardized so that everyone knows you're going to spend 7 minutes in T1 being prodded and poked, and then you're going to go on your way on the bike. So it's equal. And then you imagine the data, you imagine the data you could collect and what you could learn doing that, because you could really, really uncover a lot more about what happens to real athletes' bodies when they're really in competition. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a skeptic around the value of lab testing. There's huge value in doing testing in a lab, but there is nothing better than collecting data on what real athletes do in the real world if you want to understand what happens to the body during competition.
What are the major aspects worth testing? Would it be like some of these leading edge sensors that are doing muscle oxygen saturation, or direct caloric deficit monitors that are measuring how much contraction and calories your muscles might be burning, fluid loss measurement systems? Which type of testing do you think, if you had to pick like maybe a handful, that would be the optimal to test?
Yeah, I'd be really interested in. I don't know enough about some of those other technologies to comment, because I spend a lot of time thinking about the fluid balance and electrolyte side of the equation. But I'd be fascinated to be able to get a handle on what's happening with athletes' overall body weight throughout the course of a race, because that's a really good proxy for how much fluid they're absorbing and how much they're losing through sweat. Mm-hmm. I'd be really interested in getting real-time analysis of what's happening to their sweat electrolytes and seeing how that profile changes. Very, very interested in getting either real-time or more likely sporadic blood values for blood electrolyte levels, and also where we could other measures of electrolyte balance in the body, because how fluid and electrolytes are lost, replaced, and shift around in the body is fascinating, and we don't know enough about that. The case that I mentioned earlier about with Luke Henderson in Kona, he peeled out of Kona and was put in the medical tent year before last, I think, because he had suddenly low potassium levels, and we didn't have a fantastic explanation as to why that was, because he probably didn't lose enough in his sweat to cause that. But the theory that came back from the doctors we were working with is that that was to do with the fact that potassium was being shuttled out of his blood to keep the acid-base balance right and getting shuttled into his body cells. So just like a totally different, yeah, but we don't know any. We just get these like tiny little snapshots of that kind of data. So if we could, for instance, get some real-time blood analysis from athletes when they're racing, I think that would tell us a huge amount about what's happening with electrolyte and hydration status. So I'd be fascinated to see that.
And then when we bring in the other major factor of carbohydrate intake with electrolyte intake with an all liquid diet, I mean, the can of worms is not quite as crazy as it used to be, but it seems like precision hydration or precision fuel and hydration is now more of an entity that is focused on both. And are there studies that you're all putting into, the types of balance of fueling that we're taking in as well? Or is it strictly the relationship between hydration and fuel that you're, trying to balance?
Yeah, well, the reason we got involved in fueling with athletes was because after many years of just focusing on hydration, we were getting asked by the athletes we work with, okay, alongside this, what fueling is the other big part of the puzzle? Like, what should I be using? How much should I be taking? And we had to go through a pretty big internal upskilling on what the latest science said. And that kind of coincided with this trend towards us seeing a lot of athletes pushing carbohydrate numbers higher. So obviously when we designed our gels and our chews and products, we were looking at the composition of those products to include things like 2-to-1 glucose fructose ratio in the gels to make sure we're maximizing uptake. And then we have, because this is a bit of an easier side of things to grasp in the field, you'll have read and probably participated in some of the case studies on our website, but we try to get a really accurate handle on what athletes are actually doing in the field in these races and building up individual pictures. So we'll look at one athlete's trend of carbohydrate intake over a bunch of races related to their GI distress and their performance and how that's evolving, and is more always better? It probably isn't, but quite often when we start with people, we are nudging their numbers up. And then also we're trying to look at that data in aggregate and saying, what are the trends? So one of the really interesting trends that we saw when we looked at triathlon was that in 70.3 racing, but certainly in the faster athletes that we tend to analyze, they take the majority of their calories and to a certain extent the majority of their fluids and electrolytes in on the bike, and then they get through the run quite often on a very light intake. And that's maybe because the length of that run at 13 miles or 21k is just about short enough that you can kind of skim by if you're running fast. And also if you're running fast, it's hard to take on a lot of fluid and hydration. So we saw a big tapering off of intake from bike to run, whereas in the Ironman with the successful athletes, we don't necessarily see that, because the marathon is long enough that if you're still going to be running strong at mile 22, you can't skimp on eating in the first few miles, no matter how well you've fueled on the bike. You still see athletes typically hitting higher numbers for fueling on the bike in an Ironman than they do on the run, but they don't necessarily, but they sustain those numbers a bit better than they do in a 70.3, where sometimes we see those numbers drop off a cliff.
You're not wrong. I think, yeah. During a half, I may only go through, half of, a bottle and a half, but my calories per hour are usually around 90 to 100 grams of carbs. And on the run, I'll take in maybe 3 gels total, maybe 2 gels total with some salt pills. But I made that mistake at Roth. I was in the first half of the marathon, I kind of fueled similar, and then I totally shit the bed at like, what was it, 28K? Just saw Elvis, bonked hard. And I've had that exercise-induced hypoglycemia before, and it's been terrible. And that was another question I wanted to bring up too. Have you ever seen folks experience hyponatremia symptoms while taking in adequate sodium? Maybe they've taken in too little calories, or they've taken in too much fluid to not counterbalance the density of sodium. I mean, have you ever seen anything like that? Because it's been weird. There's been so many races when I'll come off the bike and I'll hit the 5 to 8K mark, and I'll still have taken gels immediately, but then I will just randomly, spontaneously bonk, even though I've been taking in tons of fluids and fuel.
Yeah, there's probably two different things at play there, because like hypernatremia tends to occur most frequently when people do overconsume fluid in relation to their sweat rate and in relation to how much sodium they're taking in. And whilst you do get that kind of unplugged, fuzzy, low energy feeling with that, I would say it's a distinctly different feeling to the one that you get from hypoglycemia, which is where your blood sugar craters and
Yeah.
drops. And definitely there are people, some people, we knew this from when everyone was running around wearing the now sort of defunct Super Sapiens glucose monitors, that timing of carbohydrate consumption, the type of carbohydrates, the amount you took in, definitely has vastly different effects with different people. Definitely there's a case at rest where if you take in a lot of carbohydrate, your blood sugar is going to rise as your body absorbs it. But then because insulin's released to shut it out of the blood, you can get a corresponding dip, which if it goes too low can be low blood sugar. It can feel hypoglycemic. Whether that in races, typically that would probably more commonly be associated with just inadequate fueling.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there are cases where you could still get some kind of, it's less likely to happen when you're exercising because of the way glucose metabolism works, but it's not impossible that you could feel a dip during the race as well. I definitely learned when I was using those monitors for a while that I found it really easy. I typically train first thing in the morning, but occasionally I'm forced to go out for a run in the middle of the day at lunchtime, and I have no problem with blood sugar control first thing in the morning, even if I don't eat or drink anything before I go. Normally, I have a coffee and I go.
Yep.
And I can run for quite a long time. I kind of feel like it may not be optimal, but I could run for 90 minutes in the morning on an empty stomach and be fine. If I go out and even do a 30 or 40-minute run at lunchtime, I had a really hard time not suffering from some awful, and I documented a couple of these with my Abbott Libre glucose sensor,
Freestyle. Yeah.
where sure enough, I would like fall off a cliff, and I had to start taking a gel or something 5 minutes before I went out for the run, which helped to sort of counterbalance it. But that was just an example of like time of day playing into that, making it feel awful. It's almost, and it's probably halfway between those two if I train in the evening. Now I don't know whether some of that is just because I've trained my body for so many years to like accept training first thing in the morning, or maybe it's because maybe it's the other way around. Maybe I've gravitated a bit more towards training in the morning because apart from the fact it's more convenient, it's because I know I feel at my best then. And training later in the day is typically just more difficult for me. I don't know, but getting a handle on that is really, really interesting.
That has to be so much more common than we probably all just routinely realize. I'm the same way. And now the only way to curtail that, and this is something I learned from one of the calls that you all had put together with Super Sapiens, was the propensity to see a hypoglycemic pattern was usually 30 minutes to a certain, like if you exercised within 30 minutes of taking in some food, like the propensity was quite low. But if you waited longer than 30 minutes to train, you would experience a hypoglycemic effect, really high probability. And I was really one of that statistics right there for sure. Like if I go to the pool, I mean, in the morning I could do like a 6K swim set with just drinking nothing and be crushing it.
Yeah.
Never experience a low. But then the same thing, if I do a 3 p.m. swim, and if I have like anything at lunch, and if I don't wait at least 2 or 3 hours before I train again, I could experience a hypoglycemic event, even if I just take a drink of carbohydrate just on my way to the pool. So it's definitely a balance. And I think age group athletes specifically have to pay hyper attention to that because that's their life. They've got to train in the evening. And I think when you time your lunch based off your evening training, or even having an emergency gel 10 minutes before you get into the pool in the evening, it probably solves the problem. Anyways, bit of a tangent, but still great data. And I know we're running short on time, but I wanted to also talk about a question I get a lot, and this can be a quick answer, but the packaging you all have decided to use for the pH, whether it's a 500, a 1500, 750, I think that oftentimes it's misleading because athletes are thinking, well, there's 500 milligrams of sodium in there, and I have to remind them it's half, and it's
Yeah,
really pH is designed it because you're putting yourself in a category of sodium concentration loss, and that's you're in the 1500 range or the 750 range. So that's the really only feedback I wanted to give you, is that sometimes athletes are like, why is it labeled that? And I have to explain it. So how are you feeling about that?
yeah, it's a good question. There's no right answer to how they should be labeled. Like, we started labeling them from day one as like pH 500,000, 1500, because that's the relative sodium concentration of the drink. Whether you put one tablet in, which happens to be half of that amount, you still get 1500 milligrams per liter, even though in that one tablet you get 750 milligrams of sodium. And that's because we feel that the priority thing to get right is the relative sodium concentration of your drinks. It's not about the net amount of sodium. The net amount of sodium you take in is important, but it's less important than getting the relative sodium concentration of your drink right, and then just drinking the right amount. That makes sense. So we thought it was misleading, actually, the other way around, to have a drink and call it 750 because it's a tab, but then we're not giving you guidance as to how much water that needs to go in. And I see this all the time. I see people buying hydration tabs, lobbing them in any size bottle that they've got, and that can, depending on how far out you are with that serving size, that can really defeat the object. So for me, we do get asked that question. We even have a blog, which I can send you a link to, actually, which might help articulate it to people. We're kind of caught between, like, neither. I agree that neither solution is entirely optimal, but I think we've settled on the best way, because we're trying to communicate, it's the relative concentration of sodium in the drink that this provides when you mix it as intended that matters, and the absolute net amount is less important than that.
I agree. It's more of a sports science based approach to it rather than a more practical off the thumb kind of thing. So that's how I typically explain it as well. But I think that was something I get asked and questioned about almost every time I do a sweat test. I'm like, whoa, this is 750. What am I supposed to? I'm like, well, here's why. But I do appreciate it. Just to kind of bust your chops a little bit. Now, let's see, maybe Sarah, I didn't hit anything or miss anything. The Porsche Human Performance Center, man, did you love that? I mean, was it awesome? Was it as cool as it sounds, or were you just like, this is just because it's Porsche doesn't mean it's that good?
No, it was cool. So the story behind that, very quickly, is that my first job out of college I was really lucky. I went to work for a Formula One racing team as a sports scientist. So I got to do all the fitness training and fitness testing for a bunch of F1 drivers, run some training camps, and it was an amazing experience for a young guy. I got to work with some great colleagues, some people I'm still friends with now. And as part of that process, an F1 team really only has two principal drivers, one or two test drivers, and then we also had a young driver development program. But at most, I was working with like a dozen drivers from the factory. So we actually, as a resource to the team in the factory, we used to contract ourselves out to other organizations to provide training and testing services as a commercial entity. One of the things that we did was we went and worked with Porsche for a while on their customer events, trying to communicate, just trying to add a little bit of color to them. These people are buying, they're interested in motorsport, they're buying high performance cars. Like, what does it take to drive a really high performance car like an F1 car? So I used to go along and stand up and do a talk about that. And that was cool. And then gradually over time, I got to know the people at Porsche, and they were building an experience center. And they said, wouldn't it be cool if we did something around human performance? Like, the most important component of the car is the person behind the wheel. Or as they used to say, I don't think it was their original phrase, but like the nut that holds the wheel, I think was the phrase.
I like it.
That they gave us the opportunity and said, look, if we blank sheet of paper, what would a human performance center look like? And we sort of drew something up, and the idea went up the chain. It got approved. They were looking for like new and novel ideas, and we ended up, so myself and a colleague ended up setting up a company to run and to innovate and run the Porsche Human Performance Center, and it still runs today. the concept, we did look at rolling the concept out globally, and looked at the Porsche Center in Atlanta, and that had a human performance center for a while, and we looked at setting one up in LA, but they never really got the traction. But the one in the UK is at Silverstone Racetrack, still works with a bunch of drivers today, still run by my colleagues Elliot and Jack, and I'm still involved in that business. And yeah, it's a cool spot if you're ever in the UK, and especially if you're into your cars, motorsport, and fitness. It's your dream place to go and have a look at. It's fantastic.
We're trying to build something like that in St. George, to be very honest, and I'll have to pick your brain on it one of these days to see, because that's what they're like, here's a budget, let's build something to get these teams to come do extreme human performance testing, like the Monster, the Energy, all those high performance teams out there. So that's what we're looking to do too. But to kind of cap this off, Andy, I really appreciate it. I hope this was a little bit different line of questioning than you're used to for your podcast. I've listened to most of them and wanted to talk about some maybe similar but different topics. And for sure, we'll see you at Kona. We'll make sure that we keep involving our high performance athletes with everything we can to give you guys data and taking care of sweat tests. You all are so customer focused and not just there to turn all the bucks. You're just there to make sure the sport is much better than it started. So I really want to applaud all your efforts to making what we do on the day-to-day basis very regimented, structured, and eliminating a lot of waste.
Awesome. No, we love it, Nick. And thanks again for all your kind words, all your kind support, everything that RTS and you do personally. And yeah, can't wait to catch up with you somewhere sunny and warm, probably Kona, like you say.
That's right. Let's do some sweating together, buddy. We'll talk soon. And thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, mate. Bye-bye.
Yep.